Hello legends, and welcome to the OpenAI API Masterclass. If you're interested in building out AI applications but you don't know where to start, then you're in the right place. In this series, we're going to go from zero to building out a full AI document chat application, kind of like ChatGPT, but specialized for your own documents. Here's what we're going to be covering across all 5 parts. Part 1 is about the platform fundamentals and dashboard overview. This is where we're going to learn about the basics of the OpenAI platform. For part 2, we'll be making our first API call, so we're going to get our hands dirty with the actual code. For part 3, we'll be exploring all major endpoints, so we're going to learn about the text, audio, and vision capabilities. For part 4, we're going to deep dive into the Assistants API, so we'll be building out our first AI assistant. And for part 5, we're going to be building out our full stack app, so that's going to be the document chat application. We're going to take everything we learned from the previous series, and we're going to be building an assistant that we can upload files to, we can chat with those files. We're going to use Supabase as the backend, so we can actually have user authentication, which means you actually have to sign in order to use the app. And we're also going to use Supabase to store the thread IDs so that we can build a nice dashboard that displays all the transcript conversations. Now, whatever code we build out together across all these series, including that final full stack app, I'm going to make it publicly available for you so you can go ahead and download that as well. Now today for part 1, we're going to be exploring the OpenAI platform. So I'm going to jump into the dashboard, and at a high level, I'm going to explain the different API calls, the different models. We're going to go into the playground. We're going to read the documentation together as well, so that we're ready for part 2 to start coding. Now, don't worry if you're a beginner or if you've never been in the dashboard before. I'm going to take things super slow and go through step by step. Okay. Let's dive into it. So we're going to start off by going to platform.openai.com. So this platform is actually OpenAI's developer documentation on how to use all of their API endpoints. We've got 2 main pages over here. We've got the docs page, which is the page that we're in right now, and then the API reference page. So these are both pretty much focusing on the same set of information, except that the API reference page is more tech heavy and it has a lot more information about making API calls. So the main information we're going to find on this platform is how to make API calls, the various models we can use for the API calls, and that's all contained within this docs and this API reference page. But then later on, when we create an account and we log in, we're also going to see 2 more tabs. So we're going to see a dashboard tab and a playground tab. So over here, I'm not logged in yet, so I only see the docs and the API reference. But later on when I log in, I'm also going to get the dashboard and the playground tabs. Now the dashboard is like your main admin panel for your account, and it's a space where you can make your API keys. You can look at your billing information, you can add more funds into your account. You could also look at your usage information, so how much you're spending on API calls. You could also set limits. So the dashboard is your main admin center for your OpenAI account. And then the playground is a place for you to test prompts and the different models. So essentially the playground lets you use a variety of the API calls that you're able to use as a developer, and then access all the models, but in a very front-end friendly interface where you don't actually have to write any code. You can just access the model kind of like you're accessing ChatGPT. It's already built there, and you can just change the prompt and change some of the settings and see what kind of output you get. So the playground's actually a fantastic testing ground for before you develop your front-end API solutions. You can just go to the playground, test everything out, find what works, and then you can actually build out your API applications. So for now, I'm just going to stay signed out and just focus on the documentation. Now, like I mentioned before, in the OpenAI platform, we're going to find information on all the different API calls we can make and all the different models we can use inside these API calls. So if we go across to the quick start section and scroll down a little bit, we see all the various OpenAI endpoints that we can target. So when you're making an API call, so just quickly, in case you're asking yourself, oh, what is an API endpoint? So for this example, I want you to imagine that a phone call is like making an API call, and an endpoint is like a different phone number that calls a different friend. So over here, if we use this endpoint, aka this phone number, we're going to call chat completions. If we use this endpoint, aka this phone number, we'll call the image generation, and then so on and so forth. Now, for this video, I'm only going to be focusing on chat completions, image generation, text to speech, and speech to text. There's some other endpoints that we can also access, but as a beginner getting into this, these 4 endpoints, so chat completions, image, text to speech, and speech to text, will make up the majority of the API calls you'll be making, at least initially as a beginner, learning how to use the OpenAI API. Actually, you'll probably be using the chat completions the most. So over here, I've got a high-level summary of the various endpoints that we're discussing in this video and throughout this series. So like we saw before, we had the chat completions, image generation, and audio endpoints, where we can do speech to text and text to speech. And that was these two endpoints here, text to speech and speech to text. And I've also added in the assistance API endpoint. So you're probably already familiar with GPTs. A GPT is a custom version of a ChatGPT where you can upload your own instructions, you can create your own prompt, you can upload your own knowledge, and then you can create your own highly trained ChatGPT. If you're familiar with GPTs as well, then you'll know that you can only use a GPT inside the ChatGPT platform, so you can't actually pull it out and place it on your website. So the Assistance API is actually your way as a developer to make a custom GPT and then deploy it anywhere you want. i.e. you can put it onto your website, so you have a custom GPT that has all of your knowledge and is prompted to act as your own customer support rep, or you can plug it into your emails so it can respond to your customers. And actually in this series, we're working up towards creating an AI assistant using the Assistance API. So to go through each of these endpoints one by one, we have the chat completions endpoint, which primarily uses the GPT models. So you might be familiar with the 3.5, one of the earlier models. And then as OpenAI upgrades their models, we had the GPT-4, we had the GPT-4o, the 4o preview. So I'm not including every single model here, but this is just to show you that these models do get upgraded and they actually do have slightly different use cases. So I'll speak more about why the models get upgraded and then the specific use cases of certain models, and I'll be focusing on the GPT just to give us some context about why there's so many versions of this. But to keep going with our example, the chat completions endpoint is used to generate text, to have conversations with the AI, to help you write code or to check your code and debug it, to analyze images, to generate audio. So this is a very versatile endpoint, and it actually accepts inputs of text, visual, audio, so you can really do a lot with this endpoint. Next up, we have the image generation endpoint, which uses the DALL-E model. So the DALL-E model is actually specific for image generation, and you can't use it in the chat completions or in the audio or in the assistance. So it's specifically for image generation. Some use cases of this endpoint and this model are to create images, to edit images, to give you variations of images. Then we have the audio endpoints, which use the whisper and the text-to-speech models. Once again, they're primarily used for audio. You can't use them in image and you cannot use them in the chat completions. And use cases here are to convert speech to text. So let's say you have a meeting and you recorded the meeting, you can convert it into a text. You also have text to speech, so you can actually give it a text input and then you'll receive an output audio of that text spoken in a human voice. And then you can also do translations. So let's say I attend a meeting and it's completely in Polish and then I want to get it translated to English later on for myself to review it. This is what you would use this audio endpoint for as well. And then finally, we have the Assistance API. And like I spoke about before, this is for building out custom GPTs that have access to your documents, that can run certain tools. So they have function calling, which is basically the ability to make an API request within the assistant. This is super cool because the assistant itself will recognize when to make a certain API request and then make it autonomously. And finally, you can deploy these anywhere. So once again, it's a custom GPT and it can be deployed anywhere. Now, typically the assistant will use similar models to the chat completions endpoint. So that's why over here we see similar models like GPT 3.5, 4, and 4o. And if you want to read more about these endpoints and different models, you can actually just click into all of these and read up more about this for yourself. But in the part 2 of this series, we're actually going to be making API calls using all of these various endpoints. And I'll also make the code available. So after we write it together live on the video, I'll make it available so you can just download it and also try these models out for yourself. Now, I think this is a really good time for us to start digging into some of these models. So what are the differences? Why are they getting upgraded? And I want to start by focusing on why would OpenAI upgrade models? So for example, one of the earlier models, GPT 3.5, why would OpenAI upgrade to GPT-4? So the upgrades typically come with enhancements and efficiencies. So some reasons for upgrading models would include improved reasoning. So the model can think a bit more like a human. You have better code generation. So this is a very big use case for AI in general, is just generating code, fixing bugs. You also have more accurate responses because maybe the model now has access to more information. You also have improved context understanding. So sometimes the model has to read between the lines of either the input that it's receiving or the request that you're giving and make some observations that are outside the scope of what's being discussed. So this is called contextual understanding. And actually, the better the context, the better your experience with the model. So you'll find that if you were to use GPT 3.5 for a similar conversation that you would use for GPT 4 or even one of the newer models like 4.0 or the GPT 0.1 model, your responses would actually carry a lot more depth. The improvements also include multimodal capabilities. So some of the earlier versions of ChatGPT would have only worked with text-based processing. And like I mentioned over here, using the various models, you can actually process text, you can process visual, you can also process audio. So that's what multimodal means. It just means it can process a variety of inputs. So text, vision, audio. And then we also have context, cost, and speed. So as OpenAI upgrades their models, maybe they give more context window into the request. So you can either send more information or receive a longer extract of information. Sometimes they'll be cheaper, sometimes they'll be faster. And then looking at the image generation models, so they'll behave a bit more accurately based on the prompts that you give them. They might have better artistic style and matching, improved text rendering. So you may have actually seen this before, but some of the original models for the image generation, when they were creating images that had text, the actual writing and the text itself wouldn't be written in English. It sometimes would turn into like squiggly lines and stuff like that. And the upgraded models improve on the text rendering. So now you can actually get words coming out in the picture as well. You would have higher detailed images, and then you would have better understanding of objects in a frame. So the foreground, middle ground, and background. And finally, moving on to the whisper and text-to-speech models, some things you get are new voice options, better language support, so it would work in more languages, which is actually in very high demand because people want to have the AI support conversations in their own language. You'd have more natural speech patterns. So sometimes you might get things like ums and ahs, a little bit of pause, a little bit of higher volume, lower volume, faster speech, slower speech to make it seem more natural and human-like. And then you'd have improved accuracy. So that's why we see a bunch of different models coming out all the time. But there's also another reason why, for example, we have the GPT-4, 4.0, 4.0 mini, 4.0 preview. And to speak about that, I want to bring you into the chat completions page. So if we scroll down a little bit, we can see over here that there's a couple of different models that you can use for making an API request. And these are the latest models that we have available, and they all have a different use case. So the GPT 4.0 offers the highest level of intelligence and the strongest performance, but it does cost more than a model like the GPT 4.0 mini, which is optimized to be faster and cheaper and still highly intelligent, but not quite at the same level as the GPT 4.0. And then we have the O1 model, which is used for reasoning. Now, just like a human, if you get a relatively difficult question, sometimes you need to spend a few seconds to just think about the question and then formulate your answer before you actually respond. Much in the same way, this model is going to return a slower result and use more tokens to actually think than the models like GPT 4.0 mini and the 4.0, but it's a lot better at reasoning, coding, and multi-step planning. So let me actually wrap that into perspective for you. So let's say you have a friend who is a chef, and you have a variety of different models of that one chef friend. Now, let's say you wake up in the morning and you're hungry and you really feel like pancakes, but you completely forgot how to make them. You might call your chef friend, but you might call the GPT 4.0 mini version of him, which is still highly intelligent, but a lot faster than these two models because you're hungry and you just want the recipe. So you call the 4.0 mini version of your chef friend and you say, how do I make pancakes? I just woke up, I'm starving and I'm craving pancakes. Give me the quick rundown. Now, let's say in another situation, you start dating a girl and she's gonna come over for dinner for the first time. You wanna impress her. And let's say you wanna make chicken soup. So you would now call your chef friend, but you would call the GPT 4.0 model of him, which is the most intelligent model. And you'd say, hey, I'm about to have a girl come over for dinner and I really wanna wow her socks off. How do I make the best chicken soup in town? And now for the final example, let's say you're hosting a formal event at your house and you want to prepare a 5-course meal. So in this case, we'd use the reasoning model because we're going to be inputting things like dietary requirements, what kind of food we want to create, what kind of ingredients we have. We also need to know exactly how to plan everything out, when to start cooking things, in which order to make things. So we'd be using the GPT-0.1 model because it's actually going to think about the request and then help us formulate and execute on a multi-step plan, which is what we would need in order to make that 5-course meal. All right, so I hope that clarifies a little bit more about models and why OpenAI would upgrade their models, what kind of things you get when the models are upgraded. and then when to use different types of models. To learn all about models and to get more information at your own pace, you can just click into this models section over here, and you can scroll down and you can click into each of these models to learn more about when you would use each one. And scrolling down a little bit more, we've got some more information about continuous model upgrades, different versions of different models, and yeah, just a bunch of really good information, including how many tokens the model accepts for the input and output, what the token represents the amount of information it can input or output, and then the training data for the specific model as well. And at the bottom of the models page, we can see here a list of endpoint compatibility between each model. So for example, the Assistance API endpoint, which would be using this over here, accepts all of these models. So the GPT-4o, the 4o mini, the 3.5 turbo, and other versions of GPT. We have the audio endpoints for transcriptions, translations, and speech, which is this endpoint over here. And like we mentioned, for speech to text, text to speech, and translations. And these endpoints will accept whisper or text to speech respectively for the transcriptions, translations, and speech endpoints. We have the chat completions endpoint, which is this one over here, and that'll accept all of these endpoints here, which are very similar to the assistance endpoint, but slightly different. And over here, we have the images endpoint, which is this one over here, and that will accept the DALL-E model. Now I'm back in the overview tab. And before I actually sign in and continue with the next section of this video, where we're going to be looking at the dashboard and the playground, in your own time, you should actually come here and just flick through all of these sections at a high level and just give these a bit of a browse. Now in the next video, we're actually going to be building out some of these API calls. And again, I'm focusing specifically on what I think is going to be most useful to a beginner starting with the OpenAI API. But there definitely are some other tasks you can use the OpenAI API for. So if you just wanted to get a high level overview of all the different things you could do, you could just come into here and read through the resources, read through the best practices, and just get more acquainted with the developer documentation. But for now, I'm gonna log in and go through the dashboard and the playground. So if you don't have an OpenAI account, the first thing you'll do is go to sign up, where you'll be prompted to enter your email and a password. And then you get an email into your inbox, and you'll have to verify your email address by clicking on that button. It's a very simple process, probably one you've done so many different times for a bunch of different software you're using. And once you have your account, you can just go to log in. Okay, so now that I'm logged in, I have access to my dashboard and the playground. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is go across to my settings. And here's my key information, like my organization name, organization ID. And if you're using a tool like make.com, and you want to use an OpenAI module, you'll need to supply information like your organization ID and your API key in order to authenticate your requests. Next place you want to look at is your billing. So over in billing, you can see how much credit you have on your account. You can add more credit to your account as well, and you can add your payment methods, look at your billing history. Over in limits, depending on how long you've had your account for and how much you've spent total with OpenAI, you get access to different usage tiers. And to learn more about rate limits and usage tiers, back in the platform.openai.com, you can scroll down to resources and go into rate limits. And if I scroll down a little bit, you can see here all the requirements to get into the different tiers. So you start off on a free tier, and then once you spend $5, you get into tier 1. Once you spend $50 and have the account for at least 7 days, you can get to tier 2. And then you can see the rest of the requirements up until tier 5. Scrolling down a little bit more, here you can see the restrictions on the free tier. For example, the limited models you have access to, how many requests you can make per minute. So that's how many API calls you can make per minute. And if you go to tier 1, for example, you can see now you have a lot more models. You can make a lot more requests per minute. And then tier 2, you have even more requests. And then tier 5, you have the most requests per minute. So right now I'm on usage tier 3 because I've had the account for quite a while, and I spent a little bit of cash with OpenAI. All right, next we're gonna start looking at the dashboard. So in the dashboard, you can actually create new API keys. You can look at your usage. You can look at your storage. So the storage is basically databases where you upload your own custom knowledge, and then you can attach it to an assistant, which is over here. And again, the assistant is the developer version of a custom GPT. So I'm gonna be focusing on assistants, storage, usage, and API keys. So starting off by looking at the API keys. Over here, I've got a list of all the API keys that I've had. And to create a new API key, you just click this button and then create a new API key. Looking at usage, I can see my total spend across this last month. And then I can see my spend for different OpenAI models. So the real-time API is the live speech-to-speech model. And then I've got GPT-4o mini, GPT-4o. And then over here, I can set some monthly limits. So if I don't want to spend more than $20 in a month, I can set a limit, and then I'll get a warning when I'm approaching that limit. Looking at storage, you have two sections here. One is files and one is vector stores. So the files is the individual files that you have uploaded into your OpenAI account. And then a vector store is a collection of those files. And typically you'll get the vector store and you'll attach it to the assistant. So if I click into vector stores, I've got a couple different vector stores here. And again, they can contain a bunch of different files. And if I go into the assistants at a high level, I'll break this down. So you can see that I can set the name of my assistant. I can set some custom system instructions. So my own custom prompt for this custom GPT. I can choose different models. Or if I click this, I drop down and have access to different models. And I can enable file search, which gives this custom GPT access to different files that I've uploaded. So it has access to my knowledge. Once again, you do that by creating a vector store, which is a collection of files, and then attaching it to the assistant. We then have code interpreter, which I don't typically run for my assistants because I don't do coding tasks with my assistant. But this lets you read and write code. And then you have functions over here, which enables your GPT to do custom function calls. So it can actually make API calls to different places. And then you have some more high-level model configurations like the response format, temperature, and top P. So this is actually the space where you create and configure your custom GPT. And over here we have a custom assistant ID. And later on in the series, when working with the assistants API, you'll see that we actually use this assistant ID to target this specific assistant. And that's how you can create many different custom GPTs and then isolate them and then pull them out and then plonk them wherever you want. For example, I can create this assistant specifically for my website, and then I can target it using this assistant ID over here. All right, so that was a high level run through of the dashboard. And finally, let's go across to the playground. So like I mentioned before, the playground is our testing ground for prompts and models. And the cool thing about the playground is you don't have to write any API calls to use these models and test things out. You can actually just choose whatever you want over here. So using this endpoint over here, we can test different models, where over here we have a selection of models. So if I click this, you can see that we have our reasoning models, which is the O1 mini and the O1 preview. Once again, the O1 models are for the enhanced reasoning. So if you want to plan a 5-course meal, and then scrolling down, you have the regular chat models. So the GPT 4o mini, the 4o, and then some later versions of the GPT models. So you would choose your model over here, and then you would create some custom system instructions over here to test how your prompt works against that specific model. And just like over here, we had different use cases for 4o mini, for example, for a very quick recipe, or 4o for the best chicken soup in town. You would actually verify that assumption by choosing the 4o mini and then setting up the system instructions to be a high quality chef. So while we're here, let's actually demo out my chef theory. So we've got a friend who is a chef, and we assume the 4o is going to give us the best chicken soup, the 4o mini is the fastest recipe, then the O1 is going to give us the best 5-course meal plan. So back in the playground, let's create some system instructions. And actually, I'm going to use this new feature, which is called generate. And I'm just going to say, you are the best chef in town. And if I click create now OpenAI has generated a structured prompt for me that's going to be tailored for the OpenAI platform. So over here, our system instruction is provide detailed and creative responses to culinary questions. And I'm not going to read the rest of this. I'm just going to assume that it's good enough for our use case. And I'm going to choose the 4o mini to start with. And over here, I'm going to ask my question. All right, so I'm going to ask, give me a quick pancake recipe. Let's hit run. Nice, that was a very fast response. But as you can see, it's not formatted so nicely. I can't really see the recipe so quickly. So then I might go up to here and just readjust the prompt to give me the recipe specifically. So let's do that now. All right, and as you can see here, now I'm kind of optimizing my system prompt to be suitable for the 4o mini model. So the 4o mini is going to be the fastest response. And because I want a fast response, I also want the shortest output response tailored specifically just to give me the recipe. So let's create this now. All right, nice. We can see the prompt kind of just gets straight to the point in their example. And I'm going to copy this now and paste it in. And now let's see the updated output using the optimized prompt for the 4o mini model. All right, now that is awesome. So that was just as fast as before. And now we have straight away, these are the ingredients you need, these are the steps, and these are the tips. So that was fantastic. Now let's say I want to get the best chicken soup in town. So I'm gonna use the 4o model for this. And I'm gonna leave this prompt just to show you that one prompt doesn't fit all. And I'm gonna scroll down and I'm gonna say, I wanna entertain a friend. What is the best chicken soup recipe? Let's hit run. Okay, so that was pretty fast. But now since I want to make sure I have the best chicken soup recipe, I kind of just see the recipe here, but I'm not fully convinced that it's going to be the best recipe. So now let's edit the prompt. So now I'm setting up the prompt to be, once again, you're the best chef in town, because we're never going to forget our friend who was a chef. But this time we're prompting saying that you're going to get asked for premium recipes, So please provide the recipe, but also explain why you chose that recipe. So let's click create. All right, nice. So we have the prompt over here. I'm not going to read through it. I'm just going to send the exact same request and see what the output is. So let's hit run. All right, so that was pretty quick. And now over here we have, okay, you want to make an impression with a delightful chicken soup. So now I'm actually more appeased because now my chef friend is like, okay, so you want to impress someone, I'm going to give you a delightful chicken soup recipe that has fresh flavors, aromatic herbs, and it's comforting yet sophisticated all at once. So scrolling down, and over here we have, this chicken soup is considered premium due to the use of fresh herbs and bright addition of lemon, and then more of an explanation. This is really cool. And now if I was hosting my friend, I could actually probably take some of what is mentioned over here, and when I'm explaining, hey, I made this soup because of X, Y, and Z reason, now I have some more information to back that up. So this is a really cool way to use this prompt with this model. All right, and now let's use the O1 model for a 5-course meal. Now let's choose our model. So going up here, we have the O1 mini and the O1 preview. Just like before with the 4.0 mini and the 4.0 preview, the mini is going to be slightly faster and cheaper. But let's just use the preview model for now. And we can immediately see that we don't actually have a prompt over here. So right now the O1 model is in preview mode, which means it doesn't support a system prompt. So we would have to actually include the system prompt as part of our first message. So I've written out basically, hey, I want help preparing a 5-course meal. Suggest a 5-course meal for me and let me know a plan on how to cook that. I made this prompt very short. I didn't include anything about you are a great chef and you respond in this specific way, but let's hit run and see what happens. So immediately we get this thinking response, which is the assistant in the backend taking our request and using some tokens for actually thinking about our request. All right, and there we go. We have our response. As you can see, it's very long and very comprehensive. And it took around 10 to 15 seconds to come up with this. And wow, we have a menu, so all 5 courses. We've got a cooking plan from 2 days before, 1 day before, the morning of dinner. So this is actually, I wouldn't have even thought about starting to cook 2 days before, to be honest. So it might just show you that I've never made a 5-course meal before, but I might have to now. So there you go. We've just demoed a chef friend to help us make a very quick recipe. And we had to use a specific prompt for the 4.0 mini model, which was different to the 4.0 model. And then we saw for the O1 model, which is still in preview mode, we couldn't actually include a system instruction, but in the same way we made a custom prompt for the 4.0 mini and the 4.0, we will do the exact same for the O1 model. So now looking here a little bit more, we have the real-time endpoint, which is the live speech-to-speech model. Then we have the assistance model over here. So if we click this, we can actually select any of the previous assistants that we made and then interact with them over here. So once again, we have access to changing our system instructions, changing the model, changing the resources that we upload to our assistant. And when we have the conversation, we can just review the conversation and then make edits on the fly, just like before. Then we have our text-to-speech model, where we can enter our message and have the output generated as human speech. And then this is a legacy model, which is the completions, which you can still use, but it's been superseded by different models. So at this stage, just to recap what we've done, we've gone to platform.openai.com and we've looked around the docs, specifically looking at the various API calls we can make and the various models that we can use, which we discussed over here. The most common ones that we'll be using would be the chat completions, image, audio, and the assistance API endpoints. We spoke about why models would be upgraded and when they are upgraded, what kind of changes we can expect. We spoke about our chef friend, who is excellent at recommending the best chicken soup in town, for giving us a quick pancake recipe, and for helping us plan days in advance to prepare a 5-course meal. We then logged into our OpenAI account and we explored the settings tab. We looked at our organization name and organization ID. We spoke about how we would need certain information to authenticate calls within tools like make.com. And we also looked at how to access them. So in the general tab, we have organization ID. We then looked at billing and limits. So how to add funds to our account and how to add certain limits so that we don't overspend. We then went across to the dashboard and we spoke about generating API keys, how to see our exact usage costs for the month and for different models. We looked at the storage section, so we learned about the difference between a file and a vector store. We learned that a vector store can be added to an assistant and that a vector store is a collection of files. We also briefly looked at assistants, and now we know that they are the back-end version of a custom GPT that you can deploy anywhere. We then went into the playground, and we had quite a lot of fun with this chat endpoint over here, where we were prompting up our chef friend using this new OpenAI feature, and we were able to see that different models need different prompts and they can give out different responses. And then at a high level, we just browsed through these things over here. And to get you excited for the next video in a series, we're actually going to be exploring the API reference information, which is going to give us all the information we need on how to get started with making API calls, how to authenticate API calls. And then we're going to be trying out API calls for the chat completions, image generation, and audio endpoints. And all of this is going to get us very experienced with using the OpenAI API, so that later in a series when we start using the Assistants API, this is no hard work for us. And that wraps up our introduction to the OpenAI platform. Now you have a solid foundation of how everything fits together and where to find everything that you need. Now, next up in part 2, we're going to write our first actual API calls, and that's where the fun begins. We're going to set up our API keys and we're going to start coding with AI. Thanks for watching the first part of the OpenAI API Masterclass. If you found this helpful, consider subscribing so you can catch the rest of the series. All right, see you in part 2.